Hey there, everyone. My name is Kate Lanier, and I am the lead of ACT, the App Association's Amplify Diverse Talent Working Group. I am super excited to be with y'all for our panel, Tech Desert, Addressing the Needs of Underserved Communities Through Technology. Here, we're going to highlight companies that are bringing technologies to underserved communities, the unique obstacles that they've faced, and the role that we all have to fill and what we can do to play a part in empowering tech innovators at large. So despite digitization being associated with higher paying jobs, can you try to say that? No one try to say this the rest of the panel, please. No, can't do it. Okay. Only 51% of schools offer computer science education or prioritize tech literacy at all. And when you look at it further, in an age where a great amount of working and schooling occurs from home, about 19 million Americans still lack access to reliable broadband. To make matters worse, when tech does reach disenfranchised communities, discriminatory data practices have severe consequences that actually end up disproportionately harming people of color, queer people, women, immigrants, and the working class. Without tech literacy education, the consequences come even harder for those who have been burned before, and building back trust is nearly impossible. The practice of building software around the so-called typical user can also often lead to edge cases being ignored or not thoroughly considered. And this leaves entire communities in the lurch, or at the very least, unnecessarily vulnerable. So for our discussion today, we're going to talk through the unique challenges that entrepreneurs in the app economy have faced and explore how we can use tech innovations and empower tech innovators to challenge the power imbalances in our society and make a more equitable and diverse community of app users and makers. But before we get into all that good stuff, I would like our panelists, our distinguished and esteemed panelists, to please introduce themselves, kind of give us a little bit of background, who you are, and I think we should start with Avery.
Hello, everyone. My name is Avery Freeman, and I am currently working as an intern for the App Association. I recently graduated from the College of William & Mary with a BS in Kinesiology and Health Sciences and Psychology, and I'll be getting my master's in Bioethics and Science Policy at Duke University in the fall. Over the course of my senior year of undergrad, I designed, programmed, and conducted an honors research project related to bias in artificial intelligence, which sparked my interest in the field and is the reason why I am here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Avery. Betsy, would you like to go next?
Hi, everyone. I'm Betsy Furler. I live in Houston, Texas, and I'm the founder and CEO of For All Abilities. We're an organization that helps employers support their employees through amplifying their strengths and reducing their weaknesses. This was brought out of my decades-long experience of working with people with disabilities as a speech pathologist.
Awesome. Adriana.
Hi, everyone. My name is Adriana Holst. I'm also an intern at the App Association. I'm a senior at Ohio University. And for the past year or so, I've been creating an app of my own called Benchmark. And what Benchmark is it's a crowdsourced navigation app that's geared towards the food insecure and the homeless in Appalachia. And it allows users to tag resources that are helpful to them. So these can range from access to free food, public bathrooms, rest areas, Wi-Fi, free feminine sanitation, things like that.
Amazing. And of course, last but certainly not least, Morgan.
Hey everyone, I'm Morgan White. I'm from Birmingham, Alabama. I work for Motion Mobs. We're a custom software development firm and technical consulting firm. And I'm a big community activist in the LGBTQIA plus community and the BIPOC community. I'm really glad to be here today and to have this conversation.
Well, I said it once, and I'll probably say it about 50,000 other times. We're super excited that all of you were able to join us and lend your expertise and extremely valuable insights to this discussion. So just want to set the stage a little bit. First, I want to talk about how we're defining underserved for the purpose of this webinar. And so when we hear the term underserved, many probably imagine that we're talking about people of color, the LGBTQIA plus community, those who have varying levels of ability, women, and gender nonconforming folks. And while all of these groups are certainly included in our discussion today, we're also widening that definition to be more inclusive to some other groups that technology either does not properly reach or reaches with some increased dangers. So these other groups also include people in urban and rural communities with a lack of access to reliable internet. It also includes undocumented people and people without housing. So like I said before, we're super excited to have these folks on our panel join us today to talk about the gaps that they're filling by designing safe software for underserved communities, and also just by discussing, some of the obstacles faced when creating that kind of technology. So I kind of want to start with something a little bit more strength-based. Adriana, I would love to talk with you about your project Benchmark. You saw a need in your community and you went in and filled it. Can you just kind of talk to us about what you saw and what led you to create this for your local community?
Yeah, absolutely. So living in Appalachia, you'll often hear this saying that Appalachia is in America, but it's not of America. And I found this to be extremely, extremely true. And one of the ways that this manifests is you have a lot of outsiders who they want to give well-meaning advice, usually about the poverty in the region, but it's ultimately prescriptive, it's ultimately ineffective. And the reason for this is because these are people who can't understand the unique obstacles of our region because they don't live here. So with all of that in mind, I came to the conclusion that the best way to help the most vulnerable in our community is to give them a platform to help themselves and to step back and to listen. And so this way, communities can decide amongst themselves what is most helpful to them. And so, interestingly enough, when I did begin to float this idea around, I received pushback, and some of that was reasonable pushback, but some of it again came from misconceptions about the region and about the nature of homelessness. So, living in a college town, it's especially visible because there are so many people who have moved here, either as students or as professors, who are completely unaware of the day-to-day life of their neighbors who are local. As an RA, I often see students throw winter coats in the trash for summer break, unaware that their classmates, some of them, are going to be cold that next winter. So there's a miscommunication there. I'd also regularly hear people saying, how are you going to make an app for homeless people if they don't have phones? Which is not true. The vast majority of, especially homeless youth, have phones, but homeless people have phones. And so these miscommunications and these misperceptions, they are discouraging, but they also really highlighted to me the need for an app like this so that these resources are not hindered by misconceptions about what our community needs and what our most vulnerable rely on.
Absolutely. And real quick, can you just go over the crowdsourcing element and why that's so essential to the safety of your users?
Absolutely. So again, if I am not from your town, I have no interest in telling you what will be helpful to you. And so I really wanted to just give the platform so people can hear from their neighbors and their friends what helped them. And along with being able to tag things, this crowdsourced nature also allows for qualifications. So maybe someone else put something that was helpful to them and you want to say, great, this area, they kicked me out for having a criminal record. They kicked me out for being trans. There are a lot of police in this area that stopped me when I went there. And I just wanted to be cognizant of the fact that what I think might be helpful and what some of my peers might have considered good resources don't help everyone equally. And so I wanted to step back and empower people to help themselves and to challenge the content that they see instead of telling them what they need to do to find help.
Absolutely. That's such a good point. And, you touched on kind of the misperceptions of the population that you work with. I know, Betsy, I'd like to kind of have you speak to that. Looking at the clients that For All Abilities served, have you ever felt that there have been misperceptions about accessibility and technology, especially when you look beyond serving students and as you've begun to kind of work with the workforce and the needs of the neurodivergent workforce?
Absolutely. So I started this work working with accommodations in the education space. And what I realized quickly was that as student, while it's a crisis in the education space, it's even worse in the workforce. What we discovered with our beta testing and our sales cycle is that most companies believe they have no one on their workforce that has a disability or is neurodiverse. They think they have not hired anyone with any difference. I guess they think everybody thinks the same as they do. So that has been our first hurdle to have to go over. And I strongly feel like all of us have strengths and needs, whether we have a diagnosis or not, to kind of compound that. Anyone who's over probably 35 likely was not diagnosed when they were a child as having a neurodiversity. And so all of those people are kind of have just made it through life the best they could without any supports. And they certainly don't know what supports they need. Another huge misconception in the workplace is that someone that is neurodiverse or has a disability or has a medical condition is not as good of a worker or good of as an employee as other people. I think that affects a lot of the underrepresented groups. What's unknown to people, they think, oh, that person is not going to work as hard or be as reliable. Maybe, someone who, a single mom, for instance, the perception is, well, they're going to take care of their kids and work comes second, as it should, but you can do both. So we really have fought against both those perceptions. One is there's nobody in this company that's different. And two, really three things. Two, we all think the same. That's a huge misperception. If you're high achieving and you're a good employee, you think the same. And three, that someone is not going to be a good worker if they don't think like me.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering if you can kind of give us an example of this in the workplace, an accommodation that just was so obvious and so easy to you, because we've talked to you about this on the podcast before. And you're like, some of these accommodations are as easy as just moving a lamp in a room so it's not as bright, or very, very simple things.
Right. Well, I have many, but I think one of the most startling ones was early in my work in this. I met this woman, and she was in HR at a large energy company, live in Houston. And she said, Betsy, I have a problem with an employee. He is a great guy, so smart, really creative, reliable, love him. Everything about him is great, except we have this huge problem. And that huge problem is when we have team meetings, he's assigned to be the note taker, and he's really bad at taking notes because he has dyslexia. And I was like, let me pull up my superpowers and say, why does he have to take notes? Why don't you assign that to someone else? And she was like, oh, well, because how we've always done it is the person who has this job that he is sitting in always takes notes at the meeting. I'm like, well, is there a reason for that? And she was like, no, not really. And I was like, well, okay. Accommodation number one, don't make the person with dyslexia take notes. Also, don't make the people uncomfortable taking notes take notes, because there's somebody on your team who probably loves to take the notes. Let them take the notes every time. If he has to take notes for something, let me tell you these two apps that he can use to take better notes. One, we have all on our phones, best accommodation ever, and we all carry it around. We have a recording device that we can always record a meeting and go back. And then there's so many speech to text apps that you can now use, and then just go back later and edit. It's so simple, and it's free. Every accommodation that I told her about was 100% free. And of course he has a phone, and it was very easy to implement, but people don't know these very easy, inexpensive accommodations. And that's why For All Abilities is here. We have an assessment that helps every employee find out what are their supports that they can use to build their strengths.
Absolutely. That's so awesome. It's so funny to hear how simple a solution can be. You're like, oh my gosh, why didn't I think about that?
And then they were like, Betsy, you're so smart.
Yeah, I know. Work it over.
It's really common sense. I guess if you know.
Well, while we've kind of talked about some solutions that technology is bringing, I want to kind of talk about how there have been many times where people in these underserved communities that we're talking about face harmful data discrimination practices, and that puts them at further risk. And these risks range from non-consensual surveillance to just general bad data collecting practices. It can kind of be anywhere in between. So Avery, I want to pivot to you. You have put some major time and effort into researching and understanding discrimination within AI, artificial intelligence, for those who don't know. Can you talk us through what some of these practices look like and how members of the app economy can set themselves up better to protect the users that they're serving?
Yeah, of course. Before we talk about solutions, let me give a brief outline of the issue. So essentially, there are two broad categories in terms of algorithmic bias. The first being that an algorithm is aimed at the right target, but it fails to hit that target for underserved groups of people. A great example of this is the pulse oximeter. It functions by measuring light absorption that passes through the skin. That measurement then gets sent through an algorithm, and then they get a rough estimate of the patient's blood oxygen levels. Unfortunately, this device, time and time again, has been proven to not function as well with Black patients, given the fact that it was developed and tested on primarily white patients. The second category of algorithmic bias tends to be a little more common, and that occurs when the algorithm missed the mark entirely. It was never aimed at the correct target in the first place. The reason that this type of bias tends to be more common is because algorithms are extremely literal, and they rely on very specific variables and very specific data sets. For instance, a lot of algorithms function to approximate future health needs. And because you're not going to happen upon a data set that specifically has a variable titled future health needs, you have to choose a variable that can function as a proxy. And at face value, cost seems like a great proxy for that measurement. If you need healthcare, you're getting it, you're spending that money. But unfortunately, as we all know, people of color and other underserved patients don't necessarily have the same access to healthcare due to barriers such as discrimination. So when in reality, you think you're using an unbiased proxy for that measurement, you're actually going to end up with extreme bias in the cost prediction algorithm. So those are the two major umbrella categories of algorithmic bias. And one thing a lot of people fail to consider when they're thinking about algorithmic bias is human bias. So beyond the data, beyond the machine, specifically the biases that all of us, implicit and explicit, possess that can make their way into algorithms, specifically broadening that definition beyond just race, gender, and age to include things like religion, sexual orientation, color, and more. But unfortunately, the thing with algorithmic bias and implicit bias is that it is incredibly difficult to prevent, and it's incredibly difficult to detect. And it also can present itself in so many discrete ways. You have in-group bias, you have attribution bias, confirmation bias, all these different types of biases and how they can manifest themselves in these algorithms. So for these reasons, it's incredibly important that innovators promote and foster a diverse environment when they are working on algorithm development. And when I say this, I don't mean to check a box for a certain number of Black employees or women. I'm really urging innovators to view the people that they employ through an intersectional lens, where they see all parts of that individual's identity, and they start to recognize how bringing different people from different backgrounds together is an incredibly important part of reducing algorithmic bias. And I know that trying to eliminate it completely is not ideal. It's not necessarily realistic, because as long as bias exists in our society, it'll show up in technology. But the goal should always be to mitigate it. So during the design and the development phase, really asking innovators to ensure that their algorithm is aimed at the right target to begin with, recognizing that it's imperative to pull technology at the earliest sign of bias in the algorithm. And most importantly, innovators have to accept that the mitigation of algorithmic bias is tied to so many other things. It would result in better privacy, more transparency, and increased fairness overall.
Absolutely. So you just covered a lot of types of bias. When you think, this is like not a fun question because it's not ever fun to talk about things that are, putting people at a disadvantage. But when you were learning about these different types of bias, which one was like the most fascinating to you and why? Because I saw a talk at the FCC that referenced what you said, and it was like, there will always be bias in AI as long as humans have something to do with it. There's always going to be that bias. And that was like a little nugget of information that blew my little simple mind. I was like, that is so true. Like people have this fear that robots are taking over, like all of this. Can you talk about like something that just kind of blew your mind when you're thinking about AI bias and maybe like a solution that just seems like relatively easy that is not being implemented right now?
So I would definitely say the most surprising thing to me about bias in AI is that a lot of people can't comprehend that it exists because they can't comprehend the fact that there are, in fact, humans behind all of these algorithms. So first and foremost, before any solutions can be put into place, kind of making that common knowledge. And again, that comes back to transparency, is allowing people to see the process and understand where these biases come into play. I would say through my honors project, one of the most interesting things that I kind of got a better handle on was the role that empathy plays in how someone expresses bias. So that comes back to the contact that you've had since you were a kid, outgroup experiences that you've had with people of different age, gender, race, all that kind of stuff has kind of developed the way that you empathize with other people. And that's tied to a lot of racial and gender bias. With a lot of the scenarios that I put in front of my participants, it was kind of self-driving car has to choose person A or B, facial recognition software has to choose person A or B, varying one of those characteristics and seeing how they would make those choices. And I mean, the scenario of which person has to get hit by a self-driving car, that's going to require an empathetic standpoint. And that really does come into play and is very strongly related to bias. So
that's extremely interesting. I never even considered that factor. It's something I'm definitely going to be Googling after this. So last year we hosted a webinar on the privacy of verbal communications in disenfranchised communities. And one thing that came out of that is extremely clear, and that is increased surveillance can cause disproportionate legal action against disenfranchised communities. So Morgan, your work at Motion Mobs has given you some knowledge about non-consensual surveillance and about, people of color, gender non-conforming folks, women being the people who are being surveilled and either have no idea or have kind of an idea, but it's not totally obvious to them. Can you talk us through, the challenges and what people are facing when it comes to these sets of challenges with non-consensual surveillance?
Definitely. I think something that we all thought was supposed to be a good thing was body cams on law enforcement agents. We thought that was going to be a great thing to help protect people, but in turn, it kind of has been like a double-edged sword because people are being recorded. They don't know where this data is being stored. These videos are being stored, how they're being used. And a lot of times they're being used against marginalized communities. So they're being used against the LGBTQIA communities. They're used against people who are below poverty lines. They're being used against people of color. And then a lot of times what happens is these people get arrested and then they have no funds to be able to afford legal representation. So then it goes down the line and then they are assigned a public defender who usually has too large of a caseload and so doesn't really care too much about the outcome of their case. And then they end up incarcerated. People in the LGBTQIA community are 2.25 times more likely to be arrested than a cis white man. And then lesbians, for instance, are 4 times more likely to be arrested than a straight woman. And that's mind-boggling to me that is even a thing. But it really also affects our youth as well. The amount of people that are in juvie is exponentially increasing just because of the fact that, like I said, they don't know that they are being recorded. They don't know that, anything that they say, like they say, anything that you can't say will be used against you in the court of law. And that's so true. But a lot of the times these kids don't know that they're being recorded and they get very nervous because it's their first time being pulled over, things like that. And so what ends up happening is they end up getting arrested, getting sent to juvie. And then that's on their record. And so then they have to deal with that, and they don't have the money because then most of them come from lower income families as well. So they don't have the money for legal representation either. So I think it's one of those things where, we have to change the system of, we think we're solving a problem, but it's a system that needs addressing, not just putting a Band-Aid on one small issue.
Absolutely. Okay, well, we have covered a lot of ground. I want to kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about, a major reason why some of these the problems that underserved communities are facing are not getting solved through a technological solution. And that has to do with a lack of diversity among the developer community. We said earlier, while 51% of high schools offer some form of computer science education, unfortunately, that percentage is significantly less when you look at courses offered in rural and urban school systems. Those numbers continue to shrink when you break down participants by demographic and see that Black, Hispanic, and Native students as a whole have restricted access to computer science education because they're more likely to attend a school that doesn't even offer these kinds of courses. Of the schools that do offer this kind of education, only 4.7% of students are enrolled. And unfortunately, we know that some of these environments aren't the most welcoming to women, people of color, gender nonconforming folks. So this discrepancy in access to computer science education is a leading factor in the lack of diversity and inclusion within the app economy, but also why technological innovations aren't happening around solutions to a lot of these problems. So before I turn it to our panelists to lend their expertise on this issue, I would just like to point out that one of the things that we like to do at the Amplify Diverse Talent Working Group, and we have made clear, is that we don't believe it is only up to the folks who are being oppressed by a system to do all of the work to fix the systems that are holding folks back. But that said, in order to truly understand some of the pain points around DEI in the app economy, right now we're holding this space for people who are or have been impacted by the lack of diversity, and what that experience means to them and to only them. So this is a question for all of our panelists. How has this diversity issue within the app economy, and this obviously can and should go beyond gender and race, how has this impacted your education and experience as a person in the app economy? And we can start with anyone. Feel free to jump in if you're inspired.
Yeah, what I'll say is that when you go to college as a woman, especially in tech, you're absolutely prepared to experience sexism. But for me, at least, what I imagined was very explicit and undeniable misogyny. So the kind of comments that you hear in like a workforce PSA. And of course, those comments do happen, but in my opinion, they're not nearly as harmful as implicit bias in tech. A lot of times there aren't comments that I can point to and say, that's sexism, that's wrong. Instead, a lot of times what it looks like is curriculums and systems that simply weren't made for me in mind. So an example that I can think of is I once had a professor who would regularly assign projects that were not compatible to all operating systems. So the solutions there were have enough money to buy multiple computers to do work for this one class, or be willing to go to the computer lab 20, 30 minutes away and do all your projects there. And anyone who has been studying computer science in college can absolutely attest to late night coding, 1 or 2 a.m. at least, a lot of these nights. And so I would just encourage professors to think about how many young women they know that are willing to walk home at night 20, 30 minutes at 2 a.m. That's not a very large number. And so ultimately, in my experience in that class, it was often weighed on, well, do I take a point deduction here, or do I spend another night feeling unsafe walking home? And of course, retroactively, I can see how gender plays into that. But it never really feels like you're being forgotten. It never really feels like you can point to it and say, this is sexism. Instead, it's a lot easier to point to yourself and to say, well, maybe I'm just not cut out for this. And I think that is what leads a lot of women to drop out. Of course, there are negative comments, but that's a lot easier to ignore than lingering doubts that you're just not cut out for it. And a lot of the women who join absolutely are. They just are being forgotten about by the professors who are building this curriculum.
Yeah, for me, I would definitely say that my identity as a queer Black woman has always made me feel that I'm not welcome in certain academic spaces, and that, to piggyback off of what Adriana said, not good enough to be working in this field at all. I went to a predominantly white private school, kindergarten through 12th grade, and then William & Mary is a predominantly white institution. So in addition to experiencing discrimination from professors, peers, coaches, all of that stuff, I was also typically the only person in the room who looked like me, or the only person who was experiencing all of those things. So even though the environment didn't change necessarily for me, my freshman year of undergrad, I started working in a research lab, which was something that I was already intimidated to do going into that space. Again, not seeing a lot of people who looked like me being involved in research. But when I joined the lab, I actually ended up working with an incredible advisor who was a huge mentor to me. And she used her position in society at William & Mary as a white woman to lift up underrepresented students. This meant anything from ensuring we could get into research to talking to administration if we had issues with discriminatory professors, and always making sure that we were aware of research opportunities, writing letters of recommendation for applications, just all of these things to ensure that the underrepresented students were made to feel like they were meant to be in that space. And so because of her and because of mentors like her, in addition to the personal strength that we all have kind of developed over the course of our years in this field, as a result of facing various forms of discrimination, it's been a lot easier to tackle those obstacles. But I would really emphasize in academia specifically, finding those professors or being that professor or that member of the administration that really looks out for underrepresented students and goes out of their way to protect them and make them feel like they are where they belong.
I want to talk a little bit to the women in STEM issue and then the disability and neurodivergent population. I'm much older than the other panelists, and I have I have children that I obviously had at a super, super young age. And I am amazed because back when I was growing up and a little girl, girls didn't do science and math, and we didn't really have tech. So I didn't have that much exposure. And even though I was pretty good at science and math, I didn't have a true belief in myself that I could do it because I'm a woman. There was definitely a societal pressure when I was growing up. So fast forward to me having my children, and I assumed it was different. Things have changed so much over the years, and I've been so shocked. I have two sons, and I've been shocked over the course of their lives and their schooling to see that it's still STEM is all men and boys still. We went to a math competition once, and it was probably 95% men, it's 95% boys. And my younger son did robotics and went to Worlds, and very few girls at Worlds and robotics. And it's surprising to me. It continues to be surprising to me, the disparity that remains. On the topic of people with neurodiversity and disability, is even if a school is offering STEM classes, past what the requirements are, for instance, an engineering class or computer science, kids who struggle in their other academic areas often don't have the opportunity to take those classes. They can't take those electives because they haven't, done well enough in their core classes. So they're taking remedial classes as electives, or they're encouraged to take the easiest electives in order to lighten their load. Where they may be somebody who is ideally suited for computer science, maybe they're not great at kind of the traditional academic stuff, but they're a genius with technology. They still don't have that opportunity. And I think we're really missing out on a lot of really brilliant, technically minded people because they don't have the access to those classes in their undergraduate or their secondary education. And then they decide not to go into it because they don't believe they can do it.
Perfect. So I guess I'll speak to this on a educational front first, and then we'll discuss professionally. I majored in philosophy and graduated with a degree in philosophy, metaphysics, and epistemology. So that's like nerd central there. And so seeing Black women in that field and then queer Black women in that field is not a thing. It's not something that you see often, especially not in Alabama. It's just not something that you're going to run into. But what I loved about my experience is that my department head was able to connect me with people out of state that were queer or that were Black or that were in marginalized communities, so that we could connect together and talk about our experiences, and then also talk about different things in philosophy that we liked and that brought us together. And so we were able to kind of create our own community there, and lean on each other there. And of course, you have your peers and professors to go to, but their experiences are different than mine. So that's how I would see it, like an educational front. As far as professionally, I have an advantage than most people, and I'm aware of my own privilege that I, have a lighter complexion. The way that I speak is a little bit different. I don't sound like I'm from the South, and then I seem people have no idea I have a very normal, like a very gender neutral name, Morgan. So I can get away with a lot in regards to sales and being in sales for the past like 10 years. So, when I call on a client or anything like that, and they answer the phone, they have absolutely no idea who's on the other line. So the chances of me getting a meeting or getting a call back are exponentially higher. And so that's one of the things that I've noticed is that people, when they find out that they are a woman or that they're Black, the chances of them actually making contact with some sort of decision maker decrease dramatically. And so that's one thing that I've noticed. And so they've created a lot of communities now. And I've been on a lot of panels with for Black people to get together and discuss like different tactics to get to decision makers, even though they might have a bias that they might not even know about, an implicit bias that they not even know about, and get to those decision makers, and so that they can get through the door, get past a gatekeeper. And then women have done a really great job actually in creating their own organizations. There's the National Association of Women Sales Professionals that I'm a part of. And that is such a amazing group to be a part of, because literally there's so many summits and things like that, and so many ways that they can introduce you to other women business owners, women that are in tech, women that are in like different levels of sales that you can learn from and that can mentor you, and that people that are new to sales that you can mentor. And so us having those different communities and groups and organizations to lean on for support is critical. And then a lot of times the people that have the privilege, them using their voice and using themselves as a sounding board is humongous, because it gives the rest of us that opportunity.
Absolutely. So with all that in mind, I know you just kind of touched on some things that made your experience a little less rocky, but for everyone else, and obviously Morgan, if you have something else to add, please do. Looking back on your experience, either in school, as a professional, both, what could have made your experience a little less rocky? How could a system better support today's diverse student population when it comes to the introduction to the world of computer science, or data storage and collection, like just basic understanding and tech literacy? Like what could have made that better, and what could help the students of today and tomorrow?
I would bring up the Computer Science for All Act. I think K through 12 comp sci education is so important, not only because I really believe that this is a discipline you should learn in an interdisciplinary way, which is the hallmark of a K through 12 education as opposed to college education. But I also think that, we talk about how many schools don't have access to computer science. College is expensive. and also the vast majority of students who do study computer science in college were exposed to it in K through 12. So what that means for, that 49% of schools that don't have access is that those students are extremely unlikely to ever be exposed to these crucial skills. And I don't want to see the app economy hindered, and I don't want to see the economy at large hindered, because not all school districts can afford laptops for all of their students. Not all school districts can afford to retrain their teachers to be able to teach computer science. And so it's exciting to me that we're striving to invest in all American students so that they all have an accessible and attainable pipeline to enter computer science.
Yeah, like I mentioned earlier, I had the privilege of attending private school, kindergarten through 12th grade. So funding for a lot of the programs that were just mentioned was never really an issue at the school that I went to. A lot of the STEM and robotics programs started getting developed right around when I was in middle school. And they continued to flourish as I moved through high school. But these programs immediately became white male dominated spaces that I didn't feel comfortable asking to be a part of. So of course, 100% the first step to being able to diversify comp sci and education is the funding, but recognizing that it doesn't stop there, and that funding programs without making them inclusive is going to continue to take underrepresented and underprivileged students two steps forward and 3 steps back. So for me, seeing other teachers and other students that came from diverse backgrounds would have made it more likely that I would have had the confidence, had the courage to speak up and ask to be a part of these programs, and making that involvement a little less rocky in middle and high school for sure.
Absolutely. Before we pop on over to the next question, I want to make sure anyone else have any amazing insights to share. Okay. Go ahead.
I'll go ahead. I think seeing yourself represented in the companies is like really important in the app economy, because right now it seems sort of like this elitist field that like no one can get into unless you make 6-7 figures, you're white, you've been in the tech industry for forever. It feels like it is not inclusive at all. So by opening it up and funding those who may not be able to afford it, or just having voices in the app economy that are diverse, will allow more people to feel like they have an opportunity to enter.
Absolutely. Okay, I want to pivot really quick. Adriana and Morgan, you joined us for AppCon. So we talked about, building trust being an obstacle. And that's definitely worth emphasizing when we're talking about communities that are already vulnerable and how they use technology. So both of you, I want to refocus and touch on some of those amazing points you brought up during AppCon about diversity and consumer trust and how those two actually play a part together. There is some current legislation on the Hill right now. Could you touch on that legislation, its impact on consumer trust, and what this means for disenfranchised communities using tech, with the idea of building trust in mind?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first began to talk about benchmark, a lot of people said, I love the idea. Security is going to be a problem. Building trust is going to be a problem. And I completely agree. I think a lot of the privacy questions are daunting. And I think especially when you're dealing with populations that have experienced this data exploitation and they are vulnerable and they have lost so much, that when people have been exploited before, especially with a lack of tech literacy, it takes the smallest breach of trust for entire communities to turn against you. And so ultimately, if you want to create tech in the humanitarian sector that challenges existing power imbalances, you have to create platforms that are reliable. And so ultimately, because of this, the legislation on the Hill, it does harm small businesses and tech doing new and innovative things more than larger businesses, because that name recognition isn't there. And so for us, it's a lot harder for trust to be built in these new pathways without guaranteed standards in place so that vulnerable people aren't going to be exposed to more harm.
Definitely. consumer trust is huge for small dev shops like Motion Mobs. We're a small dev shop. I mean, our team is like, I think like 8 or 9 people. So like we're a small group, small family there, and I love it. People have to trust that we're credible, and that we have the capacity and skill set, and the same capacity and skill set as large developers and these big tech firms. When we breach, if privacy is being manipulated by big tech, then, the question arises, are small dev shops doing the exact same thing? And so then at that point, we get completely eliminated. And then this puts small dev shops in a position of, are we out of business, or do we need to pivot our business model to something that is not really what we want to do? Am I going to turn my dev shop into a genius bar that basically fixes phones all day because I just need to turn a profit? Or do I need to close my doors and then I have to let go of my employees? So it kind of is one of those situations where if big tech is not setting a great example, a priori assumptions are made about small dev shops as well.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely been a reoccurring theme that we see. Consumer trust, it's really easy to download an app that everyone knows, but when you're like, Motion Mobs developed app, never heard of that before, probably not. Like, very easy for consumers, and especially once you've been like a victim of a data breach, or your credit card was stolen, or like whatever that looks like. And it's hard to bring people back into using your products. And if you're serving people like through an app like Benchmark, that's obviously really problematic if you're not able to reach the people that you're trying to help. So before we open up to some Q&A, I know that we've spent a lot of time touching on a series of obstacles that can definitely seem overwhelming at times. So I'd like to end with something a little bit more strength-based. What is something that you're witnessing in our industry that makes you feel hopeful about the way that things are going when you look at diversity, equity, and inclusion? Obviously, anyone jump in whenever you're inspired.
An initiative that I feel super passionate about is Reboot Representation and others like it, Black Girls Who Code, things along those lines, where the goal essentially is to close that gap. So for Reboot Representation specifically, closing the gap for Black, Latina, and Native women in the tech sector. They recognize that women of color are the largest group that experience the greatest barriers to the education and the jobs that set you up to be a part of the tech sector. And the companies that are a part of this coalition not only provide funding for programs, but they also collaborate with each other, which is great to see, number one, because companies are finally starting to put their money where their mouth is when it comes to diversity and improving DE&I initiatives. And two, these companies are sharing what they learn about DEI initiatives with their competitors. And that's the kind of transparency that we're really looking for and relying on in the tech sector, is being willing to put aside competition, put aside differences for the greater good, for the sake of taking care of your consumers and your employees.
I wanted to also piggyback on that and say that what I'm super excited about is this kind of more emphasis on DE&I and actually feeling like some things are changing finally after a really long time. I think with disability and neurodiversity, it's finally becoming at least talked about and recognized as something that's out there. And my belief is if we can all recognize the differences in ourselves, that whether you're a middle-aged white man who's upper middle class and college educated and the CEO of a company, you're still not normal. You're still different from every person on the face of this earth. Your brain works differently and you have strengths and weaknesses. And I think as we can all identify that within ourselves, it makes it so much easier for us to acknowledge, respect, and value the differences that other people have. And I feel like we're finally making a little bit of headway there. A lot of the bigger corporations are starting to put a big push on this kind of thought process. And I'm heartened by that we might be making some progress.
I'm very excited for the broadband provisions in the infrastructure bill. Caitlin, you had mentioned how it would be problematic if Benchmark can't reach the people it's intended to reach. And as someone creating software geared toward Appalachia, of course, far too many communities struggle with access to high-speed broadband. And after we've seen what quarantine is like, it's so clear that our economy, our education system, and ultimately our world depends on that connectivity. So I really believe that access to the internet is a human right, and I'm thrilled to see an effort in place to grant that human right to all Americans, regardless of where you live.
I think one of the things that makes me most hopeful is in the past, we've seen vice presidents of DEI all as Black men, Black women, but we're seeing these Black women and Black men in roles that are not just DEI related. And we're seeing, people of different ethnicities as like vice presidents of DEI. Same thing with the LGBTQIA community. We're seeing them on the executive levels as well. And I think that's super important for, like our children, like my little girl. It's super important for her to see, Black female executives that exist out here in the tech space, which really interests her. And then just in, any other space, it's just a great thing to see. And it makes me super hopeful that when she gets older, she'll be able to feel like that's a possibility for her and not just completely out of her reach.
That's awesome. Well, I'm not seeing any questions in the Q&A, which means you guys all answered the questions. The folks on this panel answered these questions so clearly that no one has any questions. Love that. Love a panel of intellectuals who anticipate the needs of the audience. So with that, I just wanted to say, thank you so much, obviously, to our esteemed panel for providing their perspectives for our webinar today. And of course, thank you to everyone on Zoom who's been watching and participating. For anyone interested, this discussion has been recorded and is going to be posted on our YouTube channel in the coming days. And along with that, in the description, we're going to have links to be able to find projects and information about our panelists. So with that, just want to say thanks again so much to everyone for joining and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye.